I do want to open by saying the main purpose of having this meeting, as opposed to just a general volunteer meeting, is that worship training, I think having a different leader every month makes unity or uniformity a challenge. And so I want to kind of get everybody on the same page and kind of doing the same thing. And that was the main purpose, and to kind of clean up, make worship training a better experience for our kids. So that said, ultimately, it is our desire that children join their families in worship regardless of age. And here we are doing worship training for you. But Carter and the session believe that ultimately that's the best place for children from birth on, is to be with their families in the pews. I think Robbie Castleman put it best in her book. I may have mentioned this to y'all, Parenting in the Pew. I know several families in our church are either doing this process or have read the book. I highly recommend it. I'm not going to read the whole book, but I do want to read a little bit. Parents teach your children how to make beds, hit baseballs, figure fractions, and shop wisely. There are shelves of books, columns of advice, and lots of good reasons for developing those skills. But though we have plenty of advice for finances and child rearing, very little has been written about training children to worship. In Dr. Dobson's Answer Your Questions, James Dobson affirms that spiritual training is important, and he says that the first 7 years of a child's life are prime time for this training. He provides a 28-point checklist of questions for parents. The 2 checklist questions concerning church and worship are as follows. Is he learning to behave properly in church, God's house? Is he learning to keep the Sabbath day holy? These are 2 good questions parents need to keep as they try to teach their children about church. But the help they must give and train their children to worship, not just lessen the stress of an hour in the pew. Let me read that because I slaughtered that sentence. But the help they give must train children to worship, not just lessen the stress of an hour in the pew. And I am so guilty of that. Just sit down, be quiet. I want to hear the sermon. Parenting in the Pew is written to help parents train children in the only proper behavior for church worship. This book is an expression of my joy, her joy, and learning with my children how to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Parenting in the Pew can be a hot battle or a holy triumph of grace. It can consist of whispered commands, be quiet, shh, sit still. Or it can contain the most intimate moments of life with God's family together in His presence. Sunday morning with children in the pew can be the longest hour of the week. Or it can provide the very best preparation for eternal joy. Teaching your children to worship, parenting in the pew, is entering the house of your Heavenly Father and saying, Daddy, I would like you to meet my children. So, anyway, that is our goal for our families here at Cornerstone. And I believe that should be the goal of every family. However, many families are not of the same mindset or have yet to reach that understanding, which is where the Kutzers were when we first started having babies and attending church. We weren't ready for that. We hadn't been trained that way, much less my dear husband hadn't even been raised in a church, so we didn't know anything about it. So our compromise is to offer worship training. And we don't want to call it children's church because it's not children's church. I know that if you go out on some of these bigger, or attend some of the bigger churches, they separate the kids and they have this whole different worship experience that has nothing to do with what's going on in big church, as I like to call it. And there's a separation. They're not encouraging family unity. They're just kind of separating everybody. And that is not what our session and what Carter wants. So the next question is, well, how do you teach kids to love worship? Well, that's a lifelong process. You know, you can't teach them to make their bed without being told the first time. And you can't teach them to, I don't know, what are all those other things? You know, wipe your mouth and not their sleeve. You have said that probably 5,000 times a year, and you're going to still, this is what I keep trying to tell you, you're going to keep saying it, and you're going to keep saying it. And one of these days, 10 years down the line, we hope that that lesson is sunk in. So I was at a void after I read that. Well, you know, I know I can help them in the worship training, but ultimately teaching our children to love worship is our goal, not just